Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just make a start. My name is Eamon Phoenix, and we're very grateful to the Community Relations Council for funding this event tonight. And we're looking really at the civil rights movement, its origins in the post-war years, and particularly aspects of it. So my colleagues, Goretti, Horgan and Emmet are going to look at particular aspects. Goretti is going to look at women and working women in Derry during the civil rights period, and Emmet is going to talk about republicanism and communism. And he's going to ask the question posed by academics and others afterwards: was the civil rights movement a communist conspiracy? We hope to have PowerPoint. It's going to be set up shortly, but I'll make a start and not keep you waiting much longer. In many ways, the civil rights movement, while it emerges dramatically, I suppose, in the mid-late 1960s, has much earlier kind of taproots, if you like. We could go back to the establishment of partition in 1920, 21, 22, the emergence of two Irish states, and in particular, the statelet of Northern Ireland, if you like, or the sub-state, established really in the 6 counties. Remember that Northern Ireland was conceived of as a 9-county entity by the government committee which drew it up in 1920. The Long Committee, chaired by Sir Walter Long, who was a Southern Unionist. And the idea was to have 2 Irish parliaments, North and South, with limited powers over things like law and order, education, for peace, order and good government, but that basically major affairs like peace and war, taxation would be reserved to Westminster. It was only James Craig's intervention. James Craig, the deputy leader of unionism during the Home Rule crisis and the Prime Minister designate of Northern Ireland. He intervened at very late in the day when the Government of Ireland Act was being drawn up, when the first Dáil was already meeting, when the IRA campaign was starting for an Irish Republic. And he insisted on 6 counties. He said 9 counties would be ungovernable, 6 counties would be an area more easier to govern than the historic province. Carson talks about going into the area almost townland by townland to ensure a safe, permanent unionist majority. The nationalists were not consulted about partition, which had been on the cards really from about 1914, raised in 1916, and made more likely by the Sinn Féin landslide in 1918. Nonetheless, Joe Devlin, who was one of the few nationalists who survived the annihilation of the Irish Parliamentary Party by Sinn Féin, sitting on the Westminster benches, he wrote to a colleague and said, "This is the worst form of partition, and of course permanent partition, because you would have a permanent unionist majority, a civil service, a separate court of judicature, a separate infrastructure, and of course the kind of powers, while they were deemed to be minor powers, non-reserved, affected things like policing, the electoral system, education, which in Ireland had always been controversial. Education had been controversial from the 19th century. So we go right through that revolutionary period of violence, north and south, the birth pangs of partition, and eventually negotiations for a treaty in 1921, when Collins and Griffith failed to overcome the Ulster Rock. Basically, Northern Ireland survives. It's included in the Free State as a kind of a legal fiction. It opts out years later, triggering the clause which enacts a boundary commission to redraw the border. But we're still talking about a separate Northern Irish state within the UK, while the South becomes a dominion. And of course, the boundary commission collapses by 1925. Now, in those sort of interwar years, 1922 to 1939, so much of the groundwork of the structure of the state is laid down by a stormont in the 1920s, which is being boycotted by the minority. From 1921, De Valera for Sinn Féin, Devlin for the Nationalists said that partition meant national suicide. Michael Collins supported a non-recognition campaign by Northern nationalists. For example, the council which met here, the first nationalist corporation in the history of the city from 1920, demanded inclusion in the Irish Free State and was eventually replaced by a gerrymandered, unionist-dominated Londonderry corporation in 1923-24. So during that period, really, everything that became the kind of mainsprings of the state was kind of created. The Special Powers Act in 1922, at the height of the political ethnic violence in the North, became permanent in 1933. One academic, legal academic, has recently argued that its presence as a perpetual part of the state apparatus undermined the claim of Northern Ireland to be a liberal democracy, in the sense that these draconian laws dealing with internment, inquest, exclusion orders survive right through to 1969 and the outbreak of the Troubles. Then, of course, you had the minority safeguards in and around the 1920 Act, of which there weren't many, but one of them was proportional representation, introduced to protect minorities north and south by Lloyd George in 1920 when the partition scheme was being rolled out. Yet, of course, PR was abolished at the earliest possible opportunity by the Unionists. They were compelled to keep it for 3 years under the Act. And James Craig, the future Lord Craigavon, made it clear he would actually abandon this un-British system fairly quickly. At local government level, by 1922, with the Boundary Commission looming, there was an attempt by unionism to put the natural rulers back in control in border counties, where there were, if you like, inconvenient nationalist majorities, as in County Fermanagh, where the council had declared its allegiance to Dáil Éireann in December 1921, as in Derry, as in Tyrone. So in many ways, the Local Government Act of 1922, passed again with the nationalists abstaining from the Northern Ireland Parliament, it not only abolished PR for local elections, but it provided for the redistribution of seats, the redrawing of the boundaries, the effective gerrymandering which occurred in this city and elsewhere, particularly west of the Bann, in the 1920s. So without going into the education code, which created, in many ways, as one historian put it, a system of state schools which had been handed over by the Protestant churches, but effectively resulted in a system of the endowment of Protestantism by the state. Because, of course, the Catholic Church refused to hand over its schools, which became voluntary schools in 1923, the Londonderry Act. But, of course, the state schools from the main Protestant communions were handed over. But that led to a conflict, a campaign for the Bible in the schools, for Protestant teachers, for Protestant pupils. So the state school system became very much like the old system of Protestant denominational schools, whereas the Catholic schools outside the system received no grants in the 1920s, apart from teacher salaries. In 1929, following a threat from the Nationalist Party to test the 1920 Act in the House of Lords, 50% grants were given to Catholic schools, and that rises to 65% and higher after the war. So in many ways, in these years, the nationalist community, in shorthand, becomes a kind of a state within a state. That one-third population finds itself trapped in a state which Derry, Fermanagh nationalists, for example, had never anticipated coming about. They had supported Parnell and Redmond and Home Rule. It's not until 1927 that they actually take their seats en masse in the new Parliament, which is soon to become Stormont. Joe Devlin leads them. They achieve nothing in terms of concessions. They can't overturn the legislation passed by that monolithic unionist chamber in the 1920s. And of course, in 1929, Craigavon abolished PR for all elections, saying that he wanted to get rid of dissidents and independent unionists. And that results in a frozen political system going forward. Seats are predictably nationalist or unionist. Very few are contested. In fact, the 1969 election, when O'Neill struggles to retain a viable majority, was the first exciting election in the 50-year history of Northern Ireland to that point. The 30s are years of sectarian violence and sectarian rhetoric. The 1935 riots in Belfast, 11 die. You have sectarian speeches, not exclusively, but mainly from unionist politicians. A Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state, but then Cardinal McCrory saying that Protestants are not part of the true Church of Christ in 1931. Nationalism is by this stage has abandoned the pro-treaty party in the south, which they blamed for the boundary fiasco of the 1920s, and they're looking to the rising star of Eamon de Valera hoping that he will somehow magic a united Ireland, an end to unionist hegemony in the 1930s. It doesn't actually happen. And by 1938, when De Valera signs an agreement with Britain, he gets the ports back. He ends the economic war, but he doesn't get the 6 counties, or indeed he doesn't even manage to secure safeguards and rights for the Northern nationalists. So we move into the post-war world. And of course, we're moving into a sort of a diametrically different world by 1945 to 51. These are the years of the socialist Labour government at Westminster. These are the years of the welfare state, of national assistance, of free education, a system of welfare from the cradle to the grave. No one expected it to apply here, in one of the poorest parts of the United Kingdom, where TB, maternal mortality and infant mortality were at an all-time high down to 1945. But Northern Ireland had earned the gratitude of the Westminster establishment by 1945 for the part she, Belfast, Derry, had played during the Second World War. Churchill talked about the bonds that united Ulster and Great Britain in 1943. And unexpectedly, just as the Brookborough Unionist government was fearing creeping socialism, and particularly Labour, which had previously taken a United Ireland line on the affairs of this island, suddenly they began to consider dominion status. Would we have the Union Jack in a corner of the Northern Ireland flag and go the way of Canada? Brookborough realised, despite several ministers campaigning for this in 1946, that this would be, if you like, an economic slum which wouldn't survive, and the sort of monolith which was unionism would collapse into its component parts. However, the British government promised that they would subvent the welfare state in Northern Ireland and pick up the tab. And so the Northern Ireland contribution to the British Exchequer became a kind of a non-event in the years ahead, as more and more British taxpayers' money subsidised health, welfare, education in the 1940s and 1950s. Some of you may remember then, that was the age of free specs and false teeth. It was an Elysium for the working man compared to the poverty on this island in the 1930s. Two things I remember about it. One was cod liver oil. You got two things. Every family got two things, certainly in the 1950s. One was dilutable orange, which was very popular. And the other was cod liver oil, which was poured down your throat by overzealous mothers. Happily, somebody in the Bogside was found feeding it to greyhounds, and the Stormont government withdrew it to the acclamation of a whole infant generation at that time. Nonetheless, the welfare state changes everything. And for the first time in 1945, you have a potential bread and butter incentive for Northern nationalists to begin to embrace the Union. You find this in the papers of the Anti-Partition League. Even in Crossmaglen, the local nationalist branch said there were people now who were so cosy with the welfare state and free education that they were beginning to have second thoughts about the old aspiration of a united Ireland. There's an opportunity here as well, as the historian Russell Rees was arguing just at one of our sessions in Belfast last week, where in fact this Labour government, which was funding the welfare state in Northern Ireland, could have exerted pressure on Stormont, on Brookborough in particular, to introduce much needed reforms. But there's a tendency for this unionist government to derogate from the British norms. For example, in 1945, one man, one vote, the universal local government franchise became the norm in Britain, but Stormont refused to implement it. Brian Faulkner, a decade later, speaking to the Ulster Unionist Council in 1958, said, when a working class unionist from the Shankill Road said, "Why can't we have a council vote on the Shankill? We're unionists." And he said, "You can't have it," quoting the exact minutes, because of Derry for Manna and Tyrone, his exact words. In other words, the Elections and Franchise Act of 1946, passed by Stormont, prevented one man, one vote coming in. But can you imagine a Labour government who were well briefed by the Friends of Ireland in the British Labour Party, led by Geoffrey Byng, a Belfast-born eminent lawyer? They knew there were things wrong here. But from 1922, the Speaker's Convention had applied, which meant that Northern Ireland matters within the orbit of the devolved Parliament at Stormont could not be raised at Westminster. It's only in the mid-60s that Jerry Fitt and the new tranche of Labour activists on Ireland, led by people like Paul Rose, managed to, if you like, raise the spectre of Irish affairs, which British politicians had hoped to banish to the mists and bogs of Ireland in 1922. So, in many ways, you have this derogation. Nonetheless, there's one very important reform in that post-war tranche, and that was the advent of free universal education, from nursery schools, which nobody ever heard about, to third-level education. For the first time, there was a ladder for working-class boys and girls to, if you like, pass an examination at 11, obtain a grammar school, effectively classical education, and then gain free entry to university. Now, that was available to everyone, but because of the concentration of young men in places like the Shankill Road and urban Belfast in skilled jobs in the shipyards and engineering, it tended to have a more, if you like, emphatic effect on the Catholic minority population. And of course, it becomes the real game changer. It sows the seeds of the Civil Rights Revolution to come. As a former archivist at St Malachy's College, Belfast, I can tell you that the one thing that struck me was the roll books. Suddenly, and the same applies to St Colum's in Derry, and I'm sure Thornhill and other schools on the Catholic side of the divide, suddenly after 1947, the 1947 Education Act, modelled on the British Act of 1944, suddenly you see this huge upsurge of working-class boys, in the case of St Malachy's, suddenly from the New Lodge Road in Ardoyne in North Belfast, coming into a college which had been the preserve of the big farmers, of the Catholic middle class of lawyers and doctors. Suddenly you have this new element. And of course, across the whole of the region, they become the 11-plus generation. The John Humes, the Bernadette Devlins, the Emmet McCanns, and all the rest who actually are to make their mark in the changing nationalist politics of the 1960s. So that's very, very important. No one saw that. Unionists tried to modify other, if you like, beneficial legislation coming from Westminster. For example, in 1956, the Unionist cabinet, chaired by Brookborough, decided they would alter the family allowance regulations for Northern Ireland. A rise had been introduced in Britain for each child, down to number 20 if people had families that size. And the Unionists said no, there would be no rise after the third child, because this would be politically dangerous for the Unionist regime. One of the most ardent supporters of that withholding of the grant from large families was Terence O'Neill. It was essentially, he said, to maintain the status quo. To their eternal credit, the Presbyterian Church of their General Assembly that June reared up in arms at this blow against the poorest section of the population. It became known that senior Catholic Tories at Westminster were raising questions, and at the next cabinet meeting, the Unionists decided to leave the family allowance regulations where they were. And yet, in the 1950s, there was an opportunity again for change. Down to 51, there was a possibility of, if you like, engagement by the British government with the return of Anthony Eden and then Harold Macmillan. That seemed less likely because the Ulster Unionists had from 1886 been part of the Conservative bloc at Westminster. Several actually held junior office down to the 1960s in Tory administrations. But those locust years we sometimes talk about, the 50s and early 60s, a kind of a lost decade in many ways. Harold Macmillan, speaking of Britain, said to people, "You've never had it so good. The welfare state, inward investment, new industries. Even in Northern Ireland from the mid-50s, you had inward investment. You had... for example, advanced factories. The problem was most of them were east of the Bann. This city did attract a number of large investments, including DuPont. But of course, the Brookborough diaries and the records of the Unionist Council reflect a policy of Unionists in this area urging disinvestment on the city. They told Brookborough in 1956 they didn't want DuPont, it would give too many of their political opponents jobs. And even Brookborough said, well, I can't stop industry. So they agreed that his first personnel officer would be a leading unionist, and so on. So, I mean, you have these things as well. Some liberal unionists emerged in the 1950s. We think in particular of Brian McGuinness, a County Antrim solicitor, who began by talking about attracting Catholics into the Unionist Party on the back of welfarism, who actually banned a number of provocative marches, for example, in the Longstone Road area of South Down. The march later led famously, of course, by Brian Faulkner. But of course, he was eventually sidelined, and controversial parades marked the 1950s. In fact, the Inspector General of the RUC, a Quaker called Sir Richard Pym, very famously in 1958 sent a memo to W.B. Topping, the Minister of Home Affairs, following serious sectarian violence at two marches in South Down and the Longford and at Dungiven, where there had been trouble in the town, followed by a Catholic boycott of Protestant shops. And he warned that if this kind of training the code continued, Northern Ireland would be on the brink of catastrophe, and they would return to the kind of lethal riots of 1935. So there are warning signs there nonetheless. By the end of the decade, though, that 11-plus generation were asserting themselves in terms of the councils of the Nationalist Party. A new group emerged at that time, which contained people like Austin Curry, like John Hume, pressurising for the modernisation of nationalism and disengagement from the state within a state. In 1962, John Hume, a young teacher at the time, wrote a number of articles in the Irish Times, and he castigated unionism for its lack of equality, but he also castigated the old Nationalist Party, saying that they fell back on the easy kind of slogans, easy slogans and flags and emblems. And he said, bad opposition leads to bad government. At the same time, National Unity, this pressure group of young graduates, was pestering the Nationalist Party, soon to be led by Eddie McAteer, a native of this city, for a more modern organisation, to be open to young people and new ideas. Nationalism at that time was very much a rural-based movement. It did have a seat in Foyle, but it was based really on a newspaper chain, from Omagh to Enniskillen to Newry. 6 or 7 of its public representatives were the owners, editors and directors of a newspaper company, the Ulster Herald Group of Newspapers. As Richard Rose wrote many years later, nationalism was an association of local notables. Like bishops, they were answerable to no one and answered no one. So there was a lot of challenge going on at that time. And then, of course, suddenly, in 1963, O'Neill comes to power. He was really a British liberal rather than an Ulster Unionist. He had been brought up at Crewe Castle in England. His grandfather was a Marquess of Crewe, one of Asquith's Home Rule ministers. His father had been a Unionist MP from County Antrim, killed in the First World War. And O'Neill makes his way into politics, and he does want to change things. He believes in planning, and he wants to reduce what he called the old frost of ill will in the north and kind of end the Cold War with the south. At that time, 2 other things happened that are interesting. In 1962, for the first time, the elderly Nationalist Party, and apart from McAteer, who was in his 40s, probably 50s, they were a very elderly group. Cahir Healy was in his 80s. Joe Stewart from Tyrone was in his 80s. But they sought and got a meeting with Rab Butler, the Conservative Home Secretary. For the last 50 years, the Unionist government dealt with Whitehall through one department, the Department of Home Affairs in London. It was in charge of many matters, London taxicabs, and somewhere down the list, Northern Ireland. That's where it was on the agenda. And they sought a meeting with Butler, who was the rising star, hoping they could persuade him of what was happening. They talked about gerrymandering, discrimination, special powers. And one statistic I remember from the voluminous reports in the file that they presented to R.A. Butler in Belfast was a statistic from this building that in the Guildhall in Derry, only 3 of 25 corporation drivers were drawn from the Catholic community. He listened to them politely for 25 minutes. He said he would consider what they'd done, but what he did was amazing. He immediately sent it all the next day to the Unionist government for their comment. And this produced a very flat defence of the Unionist regime from Brooke, who said that the older members of the Nationalist Party raise these old things but don't take any notice of them. And it's all very nice between Basil and Rab. And in the end, he says, I can see there's no need to do anything about this. And that's the end of it. The following year, you have the Orange and Green talks. The head of the Hibernian organisation meets Sir George Clark, the head of the Orange Order. They got to know each other at Stormont in that somnambulent chamber known as the Senate. And they began to talk about nationalist grievances. Lennon, who was a very able lawyer as well as a nationalist senator, drew up a checklist of things. They were all there: gerrymandering, discrimination, point system for housing, special powers, ombudsman, to see if they could somehow talk about this across the orange-green lines. I think Clark started off with a very good heart about all this. He thought that somehow dialogue in a new decade, the start of the swinging 60s, on the eve of O'Neill's premiership, could change everything. But he faced opposition within Orangism. The demand came for nationalist recognition of the state. The talks stalemated. They only met once. They never met again. Another lost opportunity. O'Neill comes to power and he invites Lemass up, and things begin to change rapidly. Because O'Neill, as Frank Curran, who wrote very much a study of nationalism in Derry, the former editor of the Derry Journal, has put it, O'Neill raised Catholic expectations. His meeting with Lemass very much led to pressure from Lemass to nationalists to do two things: not to raise controversial issues with Dublin, and in things like discrimination and the Mater Hospital, to deal directly with the Unionist government at Stormont. And McAteer, under this pressure, assumed the role of official opposition. But several things changed this perhaps hopeful augury. One is the decision in 1963 by the Bennett Report to cut off the Derry line, isolating the maiden city. The second was the decision in 1965, despite a vast cavalcade, cross-community from Derry to Belfast, to site the second university in Coleraine. And suddenly, nationalist concerns are growing. In the background, the McCluskeys are setting up the Campaign for Social Justice in 63 to monitor and record discrimination. And of course, one final point. In these years, you have the Housing Trust set up in 1945. Non-sectarian body, a centralised body to create housing for the employed working class. The problem was, it only produced a third of the houses that were built. The other houses were produced by local councils. West of the Bann, they tended to be the old Unionist-dominated councils in Fermanagh, Tyrone, Dungannon, and so on. And of course, that would fuel a major problem in this city. It would lead to the Caledon Squat, the first civil rights march of 1968. Thank you very much.